Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. This year, at least 35 million animals will experience pain, fear, or suffering. They are half of the 70 million animals that are the subjects of medical, scientific, and commercial experiments in laboratories across this country. They suffer for the sake of consumer items like mascara and oven cleaner, but also for cures for cancer and heart disease. There are people in this country who passionately believe this should be stopped, that no animals should ever be used in lab experiments. The medical and scientific community is equally adamant. They say animals must be used if we want progress against killer diseases and safe consumer products. Tonight, we look at that conflict, at the difficult ethical questions surrounding our care for and use of animals, and at people who are struggling to strike a balance between the rights of animals and the interests of human beings. We call the program Man's Best Friends. It is produced by Joel Sucher and Steve Fischler.
They are nearest to us on the evolutionary scale. Most of their genes are identical to our own. It is this very similarity that makes them the subjects of experiments which, for ethical reasons, cannot be performed on people. Primates have been used for a wide variety of experiments. These monkeys, housed at the National Institutes of Health, will be used in the study of cancer and infectious diseases. But behavioral scientists also use animal models to examine such concepts as love, fear, and loneliness. In this classic experiment by behavioral psychologist Dr. Harry Harlow, baby monkeys are separated from their mothers at birth and subjected to different stimuli. The purpose of this experiment was to study the very nature of love itself. But if we admit certain similarities, do we also admit certain obligations? It is this issue that has challenged the scientist to defend what happens in the laboratory.
In a laboratory, the members of the public may see things that they disagree with, but only because they don't understand. And it may take, a considerable amount of time. It might take weeks to educate that person to the point where they understood why that procedure had to be carried out in just exactly that way and in no other way.
This is footage of experiments conducted by Dr. Edward Taub. What happened in his laboratory attracted national attention and became the subject of intense debate. In his experiments, monkeys had the nerves to one or more of their limbs severed at the spinal cord. They were taught to use the limb despite the loss of sensation. Dr. Taub had been conducting these experiments for over 20 years and claimed they would contribute to the treatment of human stroke and spinal cord injuries.
I tried to bring the value of the research and what could be expected from it in the future in the terms of the potential for reducing human suffering to the Washington media, also to national media. And nobody wanted to hear. No one was interested. They took the material that I gave them, they read it, but never reported it.
But when the national media did report it in 1981, it wasn't the way Dr. Taub expected.
Police seized these monkeys in a raid on the Institute for Behavioral Research in Silver Spring, Maryland. Pacheco says he tried to get laboratory officials to correct the problems. And when
At issue was not his experiments, but the conditions in his laboratory. Alex Pacheco, a student activist, had posed as a volunteer in order to infiltrate the lab.
I photographed the abuses taking place in the laboratory. I brought in 5 scientists who all swore out affidavits attesting to the conditions that they witnessed in the laboratory. I found that the animals were just literally torn apart. They were mutilating themselves. They had surgery performed on them that left them crippled, and they were living under incredibly filthy and inhumane conditions.
The way Alex Pacheco got those photographs was to ask me for permission to work late at night, because he said he needed to earn money on jobs for tuition next semester. It wasn't typical in my laboratory, of course, but that was a worthwhile objective, and so I gave him that permission. He then got money from the Fund for Animals in New York City to buy walkie-talkies and other guerrilla-style paraphernalia, and click, 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 he took photographs of conditions that no one had ever seen.
But others had seen these conditions. Dr. Michael Fox is scientific director of the Humane Society of the United States.
I inspected Dr. Taub's facilities, and I should back up by saying that I have been a laboratory animal researcher and a veterinarian and a member of the American Association of Laboratory Animal Care and so on. And I saw his facilities, and they were atrocious. I could not believe that any person, especially a psychologist who supposedly understands and empathizes with others' minds and emotional states, could keep animals under these conditions.
There were many visitors to my laboratory, including official visitors who testified at my trials, who saw the treatment of my monkeys over a period of years, and who confirmed that the care of my animals was anywhere from adequate to excellent.
I believe that no meaningful research can come from that, and even if meaningful research that could benefit people could come from animals kept under those conditions, it could not, in any ethical sense, be justified.
The Taub case marked the first time that a researcher was prosecuted for cruelty to animals in his laboratory. Dr. Taub was brought before a Maryland district court and found guilty on 6 counts. On appeal, a jury found him guilty of 1 charge. His research grant from the National Institutes of Health was suspended. However, all charges against Dr. Taub were dismissed after the Maryland Court of Appeals ruled that since his funding came from a federal agency, he could not be prosecuted under a state law. The question of mistreatment was not a factor in this decision.
They're using these animals as a waste of...
But for Alex Pacheco and other animal activists, the Taub case was a landmark. It was more than the issue of the treatment of monkeys used in research. It was an opportunity to focus on a more fundamental issue, the treatment and use of all laboratory animals. The animal rights movement has grown substantially in recent years, with many people drawing their inspiration from the 19th century anti-vivisection movement, which also called for the total abolition of research with animals. The Bible of the modern movement is Animal Liberation, a book written in 1974 by Australian philosopher Peter Singer. The book popularized a new word in the language, speciesism.
Speciesism is a term that I use to make the parallel with racism. We all know what racism is. The classic racist was the slave trader who said, these blacks are not members of my race, therefore their interests don't count. I can use them as things, I can ship them as a commodity, and all that counts is whether it profits me economically. Well, if you imagine that as racism, then speciesism is the same attitude with regard to species. You say, if this being isn't a member of my species, then its interests don't count. It's just a thing. I can use it as a commodity, and all that matters is whether I make a profit from it. But both of them are equally wrong, and for exactly the same reason. Both race and species are not in themselves morally relevant boundaries. What really matters is, what kind of a creature is this? Does it have interests? Can it feel pain? Can it be made to suffer? Can it be uncomfortable? Conversely, can it enjoy life? Can it have a good life? And those are the things that matter. Not what color its skin is, not how many legs it has, not what sex it is or what race it is, nor what species it is. And that's why speciesism, to discriminate on the basis of species, is really fundamentally just the same moral mistake as discrimination on the basis of race or sex.
It's simply wrong to say that discrimination on the basis of race or sex is somehow culpable in the same way that discriminating in favor of an animal as opposed to a human to be the subject of an experiment might be. I just don't see those as parallel. Again, the reason would be that I think we have properties that differentiate us importantly from animals. Even those human beings that lack some of the properties that may be irrational, that may be senile, that may be very young, it still seems to me the fact that they are related to individuals who have these properties, they have parents, they have friends, they're part of the human community, that membership is morally significant. And I have not been persuaded by any of the arguments I've heard from Peter Singer or from some of the other philosophers who've written on this subject that membership in the human race, that being part of Homo sapiens, is morally irrelevant. So I'm not persuaded by the charge of speciesism when it comes up in the context of how we deal with animals.
Some who agree with Peter Singer, however, turn their beliefs into action. These dogs were taken from the UCLA Medical Center on Christmas Day 1983 by the Animal Liberation Front, an underground organization dedicated to freeing animals. Scientists claim that these actions jeopardize both crucial experiments and the lives of the animals themselves. Holly Jensen speaks for members of the organization who remain in hiding.
Obviously, if you're involved in an action that is illegal, you can't come forward and state, this is why I'm taking this action, this is why I think it's so important that I'm willing to risk breaking the law. Because most of the people who are involved in this activity are people who are good citizens. They care about the Constitution, but they feel that it is unfair in the fact that it only protects the rights of humans. This cat was rescued by members of the Animal Liberation Front. He was one of a number of animals taken from Howard University at Christmas season in 1982. And he had been used for research, and what they had done was they had destroyed the spinal cord nerve to the right leg, so he's unable to move this leg, or he moves it just to a small extent.
Public outrage at animal experimentation is a reaction that scientists have come to expect. Dr. Neil Miller is a research psychologist at Rockefeller University.
Well, this sort of thing comes in waves. Way back in times when Lister was developing the aseptic techniques that make modern surgery possible, the anti-vivisection movement in England forced him to go to France in order to test stitches. Different materials could be used to stitches that would be better in sewing up after operations. When the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University, was founded, there was a big outburst of protests that animals were going to be tortured in medical research here. In fact, very few of them suffered at all, but the animal house was burned down by a radical anti-vivisectionist, and that probably caused the suffering of a lot of animals that were burned in the fire. Now we have another wave of this.
The issue of animal welfare goes back to the mid-19th century when, as this ASPCA film shows, there were no anti-cruelty laws in the United States.
Yes, this is the United States, all right. And in the United States today, if a man wants to beat his own animal, that's his business. It's his horse. He bought the horse. He owns the horse. What he does to his horse is his own affair. But to interfere with a man whipping his own horse and on merely humane grounds, that's ridiculous and probably unconstitutional.
But public pressure and the actions of an American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals led to a law in 1866 giving the ASPCA wide powers. The limits of their powers can be seen in this 1903 motion picture by Thomas Edison, showing what appears to be the pointless electrocution of an elephant. Of course, not all sacrifices of animals were in vain. Through the use of animals, Pasteur developed a vaccine for rabies.
1955.
And thousands of monkeys were used in experiments by Dr. Jonas Salk, finally leading to the discovery of the polio vaccine. In fact, by this time, the use of animals had become routine in all areas of research. Experimental animals even became media celebrities, like Enos the chimpanzee.
The United States space effort takes a giant step as scientists and technicians prepare to orbit Enos, a 5-year-old chimpanzee, around the Earth. Flight is a success. At Kindley Air Force Base Hospital, Enos appears sound, if not happy, to examining doctors. He performed his task well, not missing a trick in the complex series of work assignments. Next in orbit, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Glenn.
Sometimes, however, the use of animals in experiments can be difficult to justify. In this footage, taken at the Fort Sam Houston Burn Center in 1964, a pig is blowtorched by Army researchers. This footage has been used by animal activists to call for an end to all animal research.
I think in this society we understand that some animals are going to have to be used in experimental situations. What I would prefer to say is that the scientist has a burden of proof to justify every single time an animal is used. Why, for what end, and particularly what procedures are going to be done. In other words, it's not a matter of who's got the rights in conflict. What I think it is a matter of saying, look, if you're going to cause some harm, if you're going to cause some suffering, if you're going to interfere with the animals in a particular way, you have to have a good reason.
Dr. David Hugh Bell of Harvard University Medical School has been conducting pioneering research into the nature of vision. He uses cats and kittens as subjects in his experiments.
What we did was to take a newborn animal, anesthetize it, sew the lids of one eye closed so that it couldn't see out of that eye, and find out what effects that had on the animal's visual system, and particularly its brain. That does sound cruel, but the animal didn't undergo any pain, and the animals seemed to get along perfectly fine, and if you patted them, they purred. They didn't really seem to be undergoing any kind of torture. One would not have done that experiment had there been other ways of finding the answer. But the answer is valuable because it potentially means that you can avoid having young children that are cross-eyed become blind in one eye.
In 1981, Dr. Hugh Bell won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this work. While it's often hard to argue against medical and scientific breakthroughs, and animal rights activists themselves are often divided, there is one issue where they are all in agreement. Far too many animals are used in product safety testing. Chemical, drug, food, and cosmetics manufacturers conduct these tests before a new product is put on the market in order to comply with the strict requirements of the Food and Drug Administration as well as other regulatory agencies. It is estimated that as many as 14 million animals a year are killed in product safety testing. One of these procedures, the 40-year-old Drey's test, involves the insertion of potential irritants into the eyes of rabbits. Household products like these have all been used in the Drey's test.
It doesn't make any sense to put lye, ammonia, or oven cleaner in the eyes of rabbits, because you know it's going to harm the rabbits, you know it's going to harm people, and you know that all the testing they do isn't going to make any difference in anybody's behavior.
Henry Spira has been a leading organizer against live animal toxicity testing. A former merchant seaman and New York City school teacher, he has led several successful animal rights campaigns. Spira believes that products can be tested for safety while drastically reducing the number of animals used. In 1979, he focused on the Drey's test and targeted one of the largest and most visible cosmetics manufacturers, Revlon, in an ad campaign.
And what we focused on was the contrast between beauty and blinding rabbits, and that was the cosmetics industry. We pointed out that you know, that it's really not beautiful to go around blinding rabbits. And what we try to do first is to, again, to dialogue with the cosmetic companies and say, look, you know, we want you to put a small percentage of your bucks into developing non-animal systems. And after about a year of refusing to talk to us, we just started a public awareness campaign with full-page ads on one leading cosmetic company, you know, basically asking how many rabbits they blind for beauty's sake.
Henry Spira's campaign paid off. Since 1980, Revlon has given $1 million to fund a new laboratory at Rockefeller University to develop a non-animal alternative to the Draize test. This new test will use tissue cultures grown in vitro in the laboratory to determine irritancy. Although some non-animal techniques have been known for over 50 years, a conservative scientific community has shown little interest in developing testing alternatives. But public pressure and new technologies are forcing a change.
There's absolutely no question in my mind that virtually anybody who can use an in vitro test will use it. It's basically cheaper to run, it's a lot easier to control, and the endpoints are usually much more precise. And there's no real reason to use an animal if the assay doesn't require a whole animal. And I think that what the present situation is doing nationwide is people are reviewing a little more closely whether or not they do need a whole animal for a particular assay.
While others are working to find alternatives to the Draize test, Henry Spira is fighting a new battle against the test that is the single largest cause of death in laboratory animals, the LD50, or lethal dose 50%.
Well, I mean, what actually happens physically to the 50%? Give them gas?
The LD50 test kills millions of lab animals, including rats, mice, and rabbits each year. It is a standard laboratory test used to determine how toxic or poisonous a substance is. As many as 200 animals at a time are injected or force-fed a substance until half of them die.
But I think the great excitement and wonder of this particular fight is that no one can be for the LD50.
Spira put together a broad-based coalition to oppose the LD50. It included organizations ranging from relatively conservative humane groups to the militant Animal Liberation Front.
It's very intensive, and it's also very exciting in a way, because in a way we're changing the whole fabric of the science community, really. I mean, it's not us in an adversarial relation with the science community, but rather, you know, how can you get things moving and generate the least amount of resistance?
Spira argued that although proven alternatives to the LD50 exist, industry has been forced to use the test because of ambiguous Food and Drug Administration regulations. Following a meeting on November 9th, 1983, the FDA clarified its position on the LD50.
The animal rights movement has had an effect. The effect, as I see it, has been as follows. We have had not until the last few months any sort of definite statement about the LD50. We were ambivalent. We no longer demanded the LD50, but we weren't publicly saying that we don't need it anymore. The animal rights movement came to FDA and other agencies and said, if you feel this way, if you feel toxicology has passed the LD50 by, how about an affirmative statement? And that's what we provided on November 9th, in large extent due to the efforts of the animal rights movement.
But the militant animal rights movement has its sights clearly set on a broad range of issues and is beginning to threaten a multi-million-dollar industry. An industry that not only distributes and breeds millions of animals, but also develops new life forms. Selective breeding has created creatures like these nude mice, tiny hairless creatures valued because they have no natural immune systems. Housing, feeding, and using these animals creates a market for special publications and products, including devices like this for killing them. Specially bred laboratory creatures do not come cheaply. A mouse costs $3 and up. A 6-month-old beagle, $450 or more. And a newborn chimpanzee, at least $5,000. Yet laboratories cannot get enough of them. It is estimated that the lab animal business is $1 billion a year industry, which uses anywhere from 40 to 100 million animals each year. One of the largest users of animals is the U.S. government, not only through its funding of university research, but also here at the National Institutes of Health. It's been public interest in what's going on in the government's own labs that has allowed the press and the public to observe taxpayer-funded research. The NIH has opened its labs because of public pressure. It also has committees of scientists who review all experiments before they're funded. And now NIH and members of Congress are proposing even stricter guidelines. However, in the competitive world of corporate research, the laboratory remains off limits.
I insist that the sunshine of public scrutiny be brought to bear on the process of experimentation with animals in laboratories. I want to see responsible, intelligent, knowledgeable lay people have the opportunity of visit the places where the animals are kept, to have an involvement in advisory boards by people who are associated with the responsible animal rights movement, because after all, animals are sensing, feeling beings. They must be treated as a sensitive and civilized society should treat all sensing, feeling beings.
One area of government-funded research remains secret. Hidden behind a maze of confusing initials, the military conducts its research without public scrutiny. In 1983, here at the Armed Forces Wound Laboratory, 80 dogs were scheduled to be anesthetized, hung in slings, and then shot. When word got out, a huge public outcry followed. Although critics claim that alternatives exist, the military insists that the use of live animals is the only effective way to demonstrate gunshot wounds. The Department of Defense would not discuss the incident on camera. But on January 4th, 1984, they announced that the wound lab would no longer use dogs. The program is still operational, now using pigs and goats.
Husky sled dogs in an Army plane are part of the Air Transport Command and the RCAF's Operation Paradog, a new role for the mushers. And it's Geronimo or whatever a pooch says.
For years, the armed forces have used animals for a variety of experimental purposes. Not all of the experiments are as laughable. This dog is the subject of chemical warfare experiments.
The USS Burleson at San Francisco plays its part as the stage is set for the atom bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. Animals that will become the medical guinea pigs when the blasts are loosed are disinfected before beginning the voyage to the lonely Marshall Islands. Altogether, more than 4,000 animals of all kinds on 22 target ships will be used to determine the blast effects. Medical science hopes that thousands of human lives will be saved by the Bikini guinea pigs.
While the newsreels made light of the Army's use of animals, the reality was very different. These irradiated burrows show the actual fate of animals involved in early atomic bomb tests. It's rare for the public to get a chance to look behind the walls of military research facilities. In this film, produced by the Air Force in 1968, monkeys are the subjects of studies using high levels of radiation.
The reactor is programmed and the subject positioned to receive a mid-head dose of approximately 10,000 rads of mixed gamma and neutron radiation in a period of about 50 microseconds. The neutron to gamma ratio at mid-head position is approximately 4:1. At the time of pulse, closed-circuit television allows researchers to view the subject's immediate responses, as well as subsequent performance.
We followed the course of his behavior for many hours, depending on the experiment that we did, anywhere from an hour to 24 hours, and noted the effects of radiation, both temporary and permanent, on the animals. But as a psychologist, I was concerned with behavior, although many of the experimenters around me were physiologists or cardiovascular people, and so I saw many different kinds of experiments. The kinds I was actually responsible for, and to which I exposed over 1,000 rhesus monkeys during the years I worked there, had monkeys doing various kinds of tasks, from lever pressing to flying a little platform that we call the primate equilibrium platform, where the animal maintained a horizontal position in order not to get shocked through the foot plates that he had. Following training, when the animal became proficient at whatever task that we had set for him, we irradiated him with a kind of gamma neutron flux that was simulating the effect of a bomb.
At the time of pulse, the subject received a mid-head dose of approximately 2,500 rads.
These data were supposed to be used to predict the effects of pilots, co-pilots, bombardiers, operational personnel, given that the balloon goes up, which is the way it's stated when the bomb dropped. When I stopped to think about it, I said to myself, even if we had these data, even if monkeys were a good model for man, which they're not, there's no measuring instruments on board aircraft or in the operational environment that would tell us what man got or what a human would get in a thermonuclear situation. Even if there were such devices, there are no medications to ameliorate or to assuage the effects of such radiation. So the data were basically useless. And as I asked my superiors how this data might be used, I received a reply that they'd be put into computers for war gaming efforts. And that wasn't good enough for me, and remains not good enough.
After 16 years, Don Barnes says, he was forced to leave his job with the Air Force. His doubts about the scientific usefulness of the research led him to question its ethical aspects. He became an activist and is now director of the Washington, D.C. office of the National Anti-Vivisection Society.
The interesting part of this whole business to me was that, one, it took me so long to determine that I was doing something that was both useless and, from what I feel now, unethical and immoral. But I was operating under a condition of what I call conditioned ethical blindness, a condition where I was taught to see the animal as a laboratory tool, to regard him as a subject rather than an animal, to see him as a preparation. To shock him, to make him do something, seemed natural in the language of the experimental psychologist.
If you have to make the hard choice between an animal suffering and a person suffering, I would cause the animal to suffer no more than is necessary, but cause them to suffer in order to relieve human suffering. And indeed, I think that it's cruel and inhumane to prevent the experiments on animals that can greatly reduce the suffering of both people and other animals.
It's gone down. Okay, I'm just going to...
Dr. Ayabomaya is a neurosurgeon who has for 20 years been conducting research into the causes and treatment of head trauma and brain injury. At the National Institute of Neurological Disorders several years ago, he and his colleague, Dr. Thomas Gennarelli, perfected a technique for recreating the kinds of head injuries sustained in car crashes. In one experiment, monkeys were restrained in a mobile chair. Violently and suddenly, the chair was shot forward, causing a whiplash injury to the neck. In another experiment, monkeys were placed in a water-filled tank, their only contact with the outside world, a tube down their throats. The entire apparatus was then vibrated up and down. The purpose? To cause brain damage.
There is a price to pay
if one wants the advances of medicine to occur. If one looks at the history of medicine, everything that we now take for granted in modern medicine, in our survival as healthy human beings, in the extension of life, in the prevention of diseases, in the development of vaccines, in the control of things like smallpox and plague and other infectious diseases, has been based on essential animal experiments. There are more than 1 million American diabetics who are alive today because of experiments done on dogs. If those experiments had not been done, they would not be alive. Diabetes was a fatal disease. My own son is a diabetic, and I know the importance of continuing animal experimentation in that disease.
And how these removal of the clots...
Dr. Omaya's past experiments with primates have drawn criticism. His critics say that not only are there significant differences in human and primate skull shapes, but that his experiments cannot duplicate the sort of injuries sustained by humans in an automobile accident.
I think that reflects a misunderstanding by the layman of what the scientist is doing. See, the scientist, when he does an experiment, does not try and mimic precisely what is happening in the real world. He takes the real world situation and analyzes it into components. And each experiment tests one component at a time. And then you reassemble the data that you get from the testing of the different components, and that's what gives you the final picture. So what to the layman looks like a very precise type of lesion, which has nothing to do with the severe head injury that he sees in a family member, for example, does not really give him the whole picture, because he doesn't understand the strategy and the master plan, which is tying together the various components with the overall picture.
Matt is one of Dr. Omaya's patients. In 1982, he was seriously injured in a car crash. This film, taken over an 18-month period, is a record of his slow and painful recovery.
There we go. Okay, ready? Run, Stephanie. Into the wall. All right. I want you guys to lose it.
While Dr. Omaya is now using computer simulations, his colleagues continue their experiments with primates. He believes the sacrifice is worth the human gain.
Certain life forms live at the expense of other life forms. This occurs at all levels in the scale of evolution. The human happens to be the dominant species at this time. And because we have evolved, and primarily the evolution has been of the nervous system, which has given us this strength and power, we are therefore dominant. And as a dominant form, we use other species, just like other species use each other. It's a fact of the existence of life. The important problem is, how do we understand this reality, this biologic reality, and make the most of it without oppression, in the sense of that we, for example, carry out oppression on animals when we wipe out whole species by indiscriminate hunting. See, I consider that kind of process to be much more cruel than the process of a scientist doing an experiment in a laboratory, which in the large vision is a very humane process.
When people think of lab animals, they usually think of primates, or more commonly, rats and mice. But what about our pets? We are a nation of pet lovers. There are about 100 million cats and dogs in the United States. We spend over $4 billion a year to feed them. We teach our children to be kind to them. We make them part of our lives. But we also use them in laboratories and research facilities. And each year we relegate millions of former pets to pounds, where if they are not claimed, they are killed. Dr. John McCardle is director of the Laboratory Animal Welfare Program of the Humane Society of the United States.
One of the common mythologies that the research community tries to promote, and that a number of people in the general public believe, is that all animals are raised for use in laboratories. And they're specifically raised for that purpose. Somehow they're produced in these clean facilities. Reality is that something in excess of several 100,000 dogs in the country come out of pounds, say municipal pounds. These are former pets for the most part that end up in research laboratories. Now, not only are the animals themselves not suitable for use in research, they in fact are inferior and give inferior data. I don't think the owners, who have now been lost, the dogs have been found, we have them here. It's the owners that are lost. That those owners would want their animals used in research, often in very painful procedures.
There is another side to the animal trading business, animal wholesaling. In many states, municipal pounds sell animals to be used in research. But animal activists have recently mounted campaigns to change state laws and make it impossible for scientists to obtain animals from pounds. They have been successful in 9 states, including Massachusetts.
The animals, a couple of 100,000 in the Boston area, are killed by giving them an overdose of an anesthetic every year. What most of the experiments would do would be to give the animal an anesthetic, not an overdose, do an experiment, and then give the animal an overdose, so that there's no difference whatsoever to the animal that one could possibly imagine. The result of not being able to get the animals from pounds makes them 3 times as expensive. There's only so much money available for research, and it's much too little as it is. So this means that some very good people won't be able to get research grants.
Sit. Good girl. This dog is precisely the right size for research. It's a medium-sized dog. We're talking in the 30 to 40-pound range. This is a socialized animal. It's comfortable around people. It knows the command sit. What happens in a facility, not one like this, which does not release animals, but generally, say, a municipal pound that releases animals for use in research, is that an individual we call a buncher comes into the facility. What the buncher does is he either goes through and takes all of the dogs and then kills the ones that he can't resell immediately, often by means that are very cruel, or he comes in and selects just those dogs that are tame, that are socialized, precisely the ones that are most likely to be someone's pet. He takes them away because they're less work for him, they're going to be in better health, therefore he's not going to have any veterinary bills to worry about, and these are the animals he's selling to the research laboratories.
These photos were taken by an investigator for the Ohio office of the Humane Society. What you see is not illegal. They show an employee of a licensed animal wholesaler loading his truck with animals from the local pound. It costs an Ohio wholesaler about $3 to obtain an animal from the pound. Yet a pet owner would have to pay $35 to retrieve a lost pet. The commerce in these animals is lucrative. While some of these dogs may eventually find homes, an estimated 200,000 dogs are taken from pounds to laboratories each year. At an average resale price of $100 per dog, this is a $20 million a year industry. But pounds are not the only source of lab animals.
Another source of these dogs, the way that they're disposed of and the way that these bunchers acquire them, is to go to animal auctions. Now, people have heard of livestock auctions, where you sell individual steers and pigs. But in fact, a number of these auctions, particularly a place in Pennsylvania, a place called Zartman's Auction in Gilbertsville, is a good example. This place has been cited routinely for problems. It's been raided by humane officers. Zartman's Auction is an example where mass numbers of animals are sold, often sick, and generally they're going to end up in research.
This is the auction run by Marlon Zartman in Gilbertsville, Pennsylvania. Some of Zartman's customers are families looking for inexpensive pets, but many are animal dealers or bunchers who buy up large numbers of animals. For years, local activists charged that Zartman's operation was cruel and unsanitary. In 1977, the Lehigh County Humane Society conducted a raid on the auction. But after a court hearing, all charges were dismissed.
It was essentially a biological cesspit. Animals are brought in from all over the place, stray animals, possibly stolen, many sick and injured animals too, and the facilities were never cleaned out between batches, and each weekend they have an animal auction. There was filth in the water bowls from previous animals being there, and there were government veterinary inspectors there. I'm a veterinarian, and I think very dubiously of my colleagues who work for the government who give places like that an okay.
But our standards are considered minimum. And one of the problems we have is when our inspectors go into the facility, by the regulations, they can only do what the regulations require. They can only see that the facility does what the regulations require. However, it's very evident that when we have members of the public see these same places, in their mind, it's not acceptable, because they may relate to how this animal is kept relative to their own pet, for instance.
Dr. R.L. Rissler is a veterinarian at the USDA responsible for enforcing the 1970 Animal Welfare Act, which sets the standards for the care and conditions of animals.
We can only see that facility maintains those standards.
This is Zartman's auction on January 21st, 1984. Since photographs are forbidden, Frontline used a hidden camera. There was a thriving business in the parking lot, with money and animals changing hands. It was a bitterly cold night, 15 degrees below zero, and inside, where the real action was taking place, it wasn't much warmer. Although it is called a livestock auction, our team saw only one goat, but there were several hundred dogs, cats, and rabbits. The animals were obviously cold, shivering. The cages were dirty, some with no food or water. Outside, cages of auctioned animals were left out, waiting to be loaded. These were the sort of conditions that had led the Humane Enforcement League of Pennsylvania to charge that the USDA inspectors were not doing their job.
Several inspections by Mr. Peter Christ, who is an inspector for the USDA, took place, and Mr. Christ found nothing wrong. There were no animals present, which doesn't surprise me, because this took place on Tuesday and Wednesday when the building is locked and there's nothing to inspect, and this has happened several times.
I'm certainly not aware of all the details that went on out there. However, I am aware that there were some inspections made on other than a Saturday night. This is not what we would normally recommend our field people to do. In fact, since we found that out, we've instructed them not to do it anymore. But on the other hand, there are things there on nights other than when the animals are there that can be checked. You know, the condition of the building, I realize it's very minor. It's naturally best to do it when the animals are there. So this was not the best time to inspect it. I'll certainly agree to that. And as I said, we have issued instructions that will no longer occur.
In July 1983, the USDA brought charges against Marlin Zartman for alleged violations of the Animal Welfare Act. A decision is still pending. Mr. Zartman refused to appear on camera. His attorney said that activists only complain about conditions as a part of their campaign to stop all research. They reply that conditions are the only legal way they can affect change. In this case, New Jersey SPCA officials arrested a dealer for transporting animals in a cruel manner. When they opened the back of his small van, they found 102 animals stuffed inside. The dealer, Rudolph Verano, was convicted and fined $5,000. The animals you see here are all destined to end their lives in laboratories. This is the Verana's kennel in rural New Jersey. Mrs. Verana showed our team around their facility, which appeared to provide adequate housing and transportation for the animals. Dealers like the Veranas feel victimized. Like Mr. Zartman, Mrs. Verana believes they are the targets of a well-organized and financed animal rights movement, and that the issue is not the conditions under which they transport these animals, but their final destination.
People express their views. Anti-vivisectionists, then they don't like it, and they are very powerful, and they are fighting not only against the dealers, but against the medical research on animals. And we are in the middle, and we are the most vulnerable.
It's an issue that has left everyone vulnerable. The research community is fearful of letting anyone into the laboratory. The animal rights movement has been accused of caring more for animals than people. But few deny that we owe consideration to these animals, bound for the research facilities of prestigious universities and medical schools. While the Animal Welfare Act of 1970 sets standards for the care, transportation, and housing of animals, it leaves the question of what experiments are permissible to the scientists alone. Others want to share that decision. They want to broaden the act. And they have their champions in Congress.
There are those who believe no animal research should be conducted at all. There are those who don't want any legislation in this area because they now are operating without any other considerations other than their own. But in the middle are a large range of people who realize that there is much to be gained by reasonable legislation, setting a floor and minimum standards that is consistent with public opinion. Because if there are a number of incidents of the wrongful and terrible treatment of animals, such as we have had in Maryland, it may very well turn public opinion against the use of animals in what is reasonable scientific and really helpful scientific research. And so in that middle ground is where we are trying to make progress.
Congressman Walgren supports legislation to toughen the Animal Welfare Act, to give the National Institutes of Health guidelines the force of law, and to create animal care committees to approve animal experiments.
The public, by and large, is very unaware of how hideous and how painful a lot of animal abuse is, because it's done behind locked doors. It's not done where the public can see it. The industries that thrive off of using animals spend a great deal of money to make sure that nobody ever sees it, and they do their best to hide it from the public, because they realize that if the public were able to see this on a regular basis, or if it could be witnessed more often, that the public would be outraged.
I'm sure there are unnecessary experiments, just like there is unnecessary cruelty, unnecessary oppression. There's too much of that in many aspects, but anything that human beings do are never done according to the rules all the time. So I'm sure there are unnecessary experiments. And I think the answer is for scientists to be much more aware, and I think this is where the role of people who are champions of animal rights is important. That's why I respect them, and I think they are playing a role. The price we pay for democracy is the fact that we have to listen to opposite points of view, and we have to pay attention to them, we have to be conscious of them and respond to them.
It hasn't always been a thoughtful debate. In this footage, shot by a local Pennsylvania TV station, militant animal rights activists staged a raid to confront doctors and medical students at Altoona General Hospital.
As a research facility, we'll leave.
They charged that this medical facility wasn't properly licensed by the USDA to perform routine training surgery on animals.
If you can show us your arrest.
I don't have to show you anything.
Oh, yes, you do.
You are not a legal representative of the USDA, and that's where the problem is. So
The hospital responded by saying that veterinarians from licensed facilities were present. But these details aren't the point. What is clear is that a defensive medical and research establishment cannot continue to ignore the animal rights movement. And the activists must decide whether their demands will slow the course of medical progress.
Gentlemen.
What are you trying to hide? Why are you hiding this?
No,
Currently, there are several bills before Congress designed to reduce lab animal suffering. New legislation would require that all research be approved by animal care committees, that pain be minimized, unnecessary duplication of experiments avoided, and that alternative research using no animals be fully considered. The General Accounting Office is just concluding an investigation of the Department of Agriculture's Animal and Health Inspection Service. A report due to be released this summer is expected to level a number of charges, including the fact that in California, the state with the second highest number of research facilities, 52% of all animal labs are not even inspected once a year. Animal rights groups in California recently threatened to sue the USDA for failure to enforce the law at the University of California at Berkeley. For the past 4 years, the university's own chief veterinarian has refused to sign the USDA-required statement that the university is in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act. In March, Berkeley lost accreditation for its animal labs. In April, the USDA announced that it will pursue legal measures against the university in this major controversial case.